The young man across the street is building his house with his own hands and using his own resources. He's been a long time building it, and sometimes we think his work will never be finished. But this we know. Each hour, each day, brings him closer to the completion of the kind of structure he has planned for his family. The work our church does through its Board of Pensions is much like the building of the house. It seems to take a long time. There are disappointments and delays. But we know that out of our own resources, we are building a solid structure which will care for our own. Let's look at the Reverend Horace B. Williamson, pastor for the last 3 years of Calvary Presbyterian Church. He's 41, and this is his 4th pastorate. This is Calvary Church. Not very big, not very fancy, but of such is the Presbyterian Church largely composed. This is the congregation of Calvary Church, the people who have encouraged Reverend Mr. Williamson in his work by their enthusiastic response to his ministry. And these are the young people. They like their pastor because he leads them without seeming to lead and teaches them without seeming to teach. It's a healthy situation, and the Reverend Mr. Williamson is happy in it. Although sometimes, like the rest of us, he has to think about money. His salary is $3,800 a year, and it probably never will be much more. That figure includes an estimate of what the manse would cost if the family had to pay rent for it. This is the family, young Mrs. Williamson and the children, Carolyn and Doris. The girls want to go to college, and of course they should. But the Williamsons have exactly $237.94 in the bank and a $5,000 insurance policy on Mr. Williamson's life. These are their assets, plus a car with 7 payments to go. Yet, like every other American, Mr. Williamson must provide somehow for the future. So, he has joined the service pension plan of the Presbyterian Church. That's why once every month, almost unnoticed, an important event takes place. Jim Campbell, the church treasurer, writes a check to the Presbyterian Board of Pensions. To make up the check, 3% is deducted from the minister's total salary each month, and from the church treasury comes another 9%. The Board of Pensions keeps this money for Mr. Williamson and invests it carefully. Here is the amount paid by the pastor, shown in blue, and the larger amount paid by the church, shown in red. The green circle portrays the increase as the money grows in volume because the dues are faithfully paid over the years, 40 of them in a normal ministerial career, and because careful investment brings substantial returns. Let's say that Reverend Mr. Horace Williamson's salaries through a 40-year period will average $3,800, the exact amount he happens to be earning now. When he retires, his pension, not charity, not relief, but the pension to which he is entitled, will be exactly half of his annual average salary, or $1,900 per year. Like my neighbor's house, which is not yet complete, the Presbyterian Service Pension Plan is not yet full-grown. This has made a difficult problem for the Reverend Dr. William B. Ferguson, who is now retired. His ministry lasted more than 40 years, but since the church created the pension plan midway in his career, only half of his work years were covered. And he receives a pension only half as large as it would be if the service pension plan had been started sooner. Dr. Ferguson has skilled hands with which he makes intricate and lovely things. People buy his products because they value fine workmanship. But this money, together with the small pension, cannot be stretched to pay the rising costs of food and clothing. And Mrs. Ferguson has to buy special medicines every week. A fortunate little church has made Dr. Ferguson its supply pastor until it can find a younger man to serve permanently. They pay him $1,500 a year, which helps balance the two sides of the Ferguson budget. Dr. Ferguson has an older brother still living who is also a minister. When he retired, the service pension plan had been in existence only 5 years, so he had even less opportunity to build up pension credits. His pension would be even lower than it is if the Presbyterian Church had not set a minimum of $600 for situations like this. He has grown too feeble to preach, and he has no marketable skill. How do he and his wife live? They live by reason of the fact that enough people care. Their daughter is married, and she and her husband send something every 2 weeks. Fortunately, the Board of Pensions has been given a welfare fund with which to supplement inadequate pensions, provided the presbytery shares. This money from the welfare fund ought not to be necessary, but our task in pensions is not yet finished. The Fergusons of tomorrow will fare much better, but meanwhile provision must be made for today. For many elderly Presbyterians, a church-sponsored home is the answer to the need for shelter and care. There are 46 such homes. 4 are operated by the church nationally through the Board of Pensions for retired ministers, missionaries, their wives, and widows. But they house fewer than 100 guests in all, and there are some 7,000 persons now on pension. The church-sponsored homes are full, and most have waiting lists. And they do not meet every kind of need for every kind of person, for most of them cannot take elderly people who are disabled or need continuous care. The problem of chronic illness is being faced by our church, however, for it has directed the Board of Pensions to provide infirmaries to house those who need constant care. And this service of the church, which is only now becoming available, together with the institutions for the aged, which are actually not very institutional at all, stand as monuments to our determination to take care of our own. Taking care of our own involves more than making provision for old age needs and chronic illness, however, for sometimes tragedy strikes like lightning and rumbles on and on like thunder. This is the Reverend Thomas Ralston Wengert, age 32. 2 years ago, he was the pastor of an active, growing church, and he and his wife had taken their places in the community as valuable members. That was the year their little girl was born, and the family seemed complete with the 2-year-old son and the new baby daughter. But it was also the year of the tragic accident. Mr. Wengert survived this crash, but it's doubtful if the family will ever recover from the loss of hopes and dreams and savings that were its aftermath. The greatest cost was in heartbreak, but the hard, cold costs in cash mounted daily as well. Despite hospitalization insurance, despite the generosity of a doctor who charged nothing, Thomas Wengert's bill exceeded $1,100. It was necessary to call in an orthopedic specialist, to take x-rays, to hire physiotherapists, and there was room rent for a long period after the hospitalization insurance had run out. Mrs. Wengert arranged to move their furnishings out of the manse and into her mother's home in another state. And before Mr. Wengert came home, she purchased a specially constructed bed and wheelchair. Ongoing medical and nursing care added to their load. And when Mrs. Wengert went back to secretarial school to relearn her forgotten skills in shorthand and office practice, this additional cost brought their expenses to more than $3,000, a debt the Wengerts had no possible way of meeting. This $3,000 was one problem, but it was by no means unrelated to the fact that Mr. Wengert would produce no income for a long, long time. Then the Presbyterian Church set its machinery in motion. The Welfare Fund is a special fund made possible by the benevolence giving of church members to provide outright grants in situations like this one. The minister's congregation and the local presbytery match the grant with equal sums, if it is possible. In the Wengerts' case, each of the 3 sources paid $1,000 and wiped out the debt. Mrs. Wengert's mother cared for the invalid, while Mrs. Wengert found a job as a secretary. Her salary, plus the regrettably small $1,000 a year paid to disabled ministers by the service pension plan, kept the family going and together. Thus, while our pension and relief task is not yet finished, the work goes forward. The plan is continually being improved. For example, in January of 1952 and again in July 1954, additional benefits were provided for widows and orphans. These new benefits were made possible by the pension dues paid by the church, not the minister, and they are proving their worth for the great good they do. Consider the benefits for the family of the Reverend Oscar Tremont, who died quite unexpectedly of a blood disease. During the difficult period of readjustment, each month for 9 consecutive months following his death, Mrs. Tremont received his full salary check, which gave her exactly the income to which she had been accustomed. And both Mary and Harold will receive $100 a year until they are 21. In addition, Harold, who is in college, will receive $300 for each of the remaining years of his college career, and Mary will receive $1,200 toward her college education. Mrs. Tremont is employed now as a librarian. That's what she was when she met Oscar 30 years ago. And after his death, she applied at the local library. She's only a second assistant, but the work provides food and shelter for the family and gives her creative activity. She will receive $456.25 a year for the rest of her life from the pension board. The board calls this a widow's benefit, but it's a little like life insurance. Let's look at Oscar Tremont's pension program. These are Mr. Tremont's dues, his church's dues, and the amount they've grown through accrued interest. They could be anybody's dues. Most of this money is, of course, destined for payments during a pastor's old age, but some of it goes for insurance of several kinds. This slice, which has been cut off, goes to pay for insurance, the kind which paid Oscar Tremont's salary for 9 months after he died, the kind which pays Mrs. Tremont something, however small, as long as she lives, the kind which helps with Harold and Mary's college expenses, and the kind that pays disability benefits to the Wengerts while Tom is unable to work. To be sure, these insurance benefits come out of the dues paid on behalf of the Reverend Mr. Horace Williamson by the churches he has served, as well as out of the dues paid for the Reverend Mr. Thomas Wengert and the Reverend Mr. Oscar Tremont. But the ministers not touched by disability or death do not mind at all. It is as if they had fire insurance and never had a fire. The Board of Pensions operates as do the insurance companies, by observing all the mathematical and scientific procedures which ensure its financial and actuarial soundness at all times. The church has been concerned with this problem for more than 200 years. It was called in the beginning the Fund for Pious Uses, and ministerial relief for aged ministers or their widows was one among many other branches of its work. This fund was also used to preach the gospel to the Indians and to send ministers to the far frontiers. As the pages of American history were turned, various relief and pension plans were tried and outgrown or discarded for better ones. Outright grants of relief, gifts of charity, monies from a sustentation fund were each in their time the testimony of concern, until in the 1920s, the Presbyterian Church set about raising a $15 million fund for the foundation upon which to build the present solid plan. Men who began their ministry in 1927 will retire around 1967 and will be the first to realize the full fruit of that vision. At the present time, more than 2,000 ministers are retired and receiving pensions, while younger men have taken their places. Each is a folder in the pension files, but more than that, much more. To the members of the pension board elected by the church, each represents an assignment in compassion. The board knows that for the retired minister, housing is a major problem, that when a man has lived all his life in manses owned by churches, It is difficult when most of life is past to buy a house or to manage the payment of rent. But they know as well that 59% of our retired ministers do own their own homes, and a large majority have incomes at least half as large as they had in the last year they worked before retirement, which means that though it may have worked great hardship, they save through the years for themselves, in excess of the pension plan. The pension board keeps in touch with the widows of our deceased ministers, 3,000 of them, and with the members of the family as the children mature. And it points out as well the new and continuing needs and ways of meeting them. At the present time, for instance, a division of welfare agencies is counseling with the orphanages, the homes, and the hospitals that have long been operated by Presbyterian groups. The decisions of this pension board, by direction of the General Assembly, find expression in the work of a staff, which includes actuaries to compute the financial demands imposed by the long life of ministers, and accountants to record faithfully the exact details of each transaction, and 4 field representatives who work through presbytery committees on pensions. It is through these committees the church demonstrates her concern to care for her own. Yes, the church, like my neighbor across the street, is building a house. It's far enough along to provide shelter for its large Presbyterian family, and they're living in it and enjoying it. It may never really be complete, because when the present work is done, new rooms may be needed. Tomorrow, infirmary care, and the day after tomorrow, the church may be able to increase the disability benefits. But even though the house is incomplete, the family is living in it and enjoying it. Thomas Wengert is out of debt. Harold Tremont will stay on in college. And Horace Williamson will get his full pension. More money, more effort, more sacrifice must go into our building before an adequate and secure shelter will be ready for those we love. But as a church, we have rolled up our sleeves and taken up our tools. We have the vitality and determination to complete the job. When you give to support your church, you are building this house. You are demonstrating your concern. You are providing your share of the funds for this ministry to those for whom we care. After all, we are making tomorrow and working in the name of Christ, the master builder.